Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Farah Hussain, former Fortune 200 director, current executive coach, and author of The Pivotal Leader on Substack. I am so excited to have Quratul-Ann Malik with us today. She is our very first guest in our new interview series for The Pivotal Leader that is designed to normalize pivoting. We'll be speaking with amazing leaders who have mastered pivots in their journeys to build and lead businesses that are meeting real needs. Q, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be the first guest.
And to let the audience know a little bit about you, you are the founder and CEO of Oscar AI. Oscar AI is an operating system that helps frontline service businesses turn data into action. Q brings together her experience in policy, tech, and entrepreneurship to launch Oscar AI to help operators from QSRs to retailers scale smarter and build better businesses. Q, as we get started, I have to tell you, you inspired my definition of pivotal leadership, which is the foundation of the pivotal leader on Substack. I define pivotal leadership as a form of guiding oneself and others to fulfill a purpose that is centered on truth. You've often told me about how one of the ways that you find focus as a founder and a CEO is to be truth seeking. As a coach, I would call that one of your core values. And I was curious if you could tell us, what does truth seeking mean in the context of your business?
Yeah. Well, thanks for it. That's such a nice thing to say, that it inspired your way of thinking about pivotal leadership. Truth seeking is such an interesting phrase, and it's for me work that helps me like stay objective and like grounded in reality. When you're doing something as like creative or like as difficult as trying to figure out like who you want to be or how you want your career to unfold or how you want your company to be, you sort of don't always have a good framework of like, how do I ground myself in like what is reality and like what is aligned with like my purpose and what I feel like is true. There are always a lot of inputs that are coming from outside, even from inside yourself, and just staying grounded in like what is the most honest version of reality as it exists. It's intention and the effort of trying to be objective and trying to be intellectually like honest with yourself is really, really what that's all about.
Being objective, being honest. I remember even when you decided to start a company, you had said to me, I just know I'm meant to be doing this. In what way did truth seeking help you find this path to being a tech founder?
Yeah, that's such a hard question. Because it was such a personal decision. The truth for you is like different in terms of like what feels aligned and what feels right for me. For me, it was always like a calling, a knowing. And there were obviously like logical pieces to it of like, I want to do something with impact. I had like worked at the White House. I had like seen a lot of mission oriented people start companies and like make a huge dent in the world and do it in a very short period of time. And I found that very inspiring because like as someone who always was inspired by impact, I always thought like the way you do that is like through policy or government or nonprofit, and just sort of seeing like this other world at the White House was very eye-opening. When it was time and we started talking about whether I should start a company, at that moment it just everything kind of aligned. Like logically it felt like it made sense, emotionally it felt like it made sense, and like personally I couldn't think of anything else I wanted to do. Truth, I think, also is one of those things where it's like inner and the outer is aligned. You've like triangulated, you've thought through a lot of different ways of analyzing the problem, and kind of if you're coming to the same conclusion, to me that's like generally a pretty good sign that you're in line with the truth.
Yeah. And actually, what you're describing, it is similar to what I call finding evidence. Like sometimes evidence is hard evidence. You have some quantitative measure that says, I should go down this path. But other times, evidence is what you're describing. It might be a little squishier. Maybe there's a certain intuition that you have that just keeps recurring, even as the environment around you might be changing, your circumstances might be changing, but there's something that's like tugging that says there's something here And that itself is a truth, whether it's something that others can observe or not.
Yeah, I think
And when it came to the practical aspect of building your business, you started with an idea, it changed over time.
yes.
How did you know that it was time to pivot from your original concept for your business?
At the stage we were at, we were early enough where we had seen enough data and had enough evidence to kind of conclude that there was another direction pulling at us. It didn't feel like, oh, we're turning and we're going in a totally opposite direction. It kind of felt more like an evolution. And I think that like mindset of like, we're learning and we're growing and we're learning and we're growing, and like, rather than just being like, oh, I'm throwing it all away to do something else. I think that mindset of you're adapting to new information is helpful.
What advice do you have for founders who are afraid to pivot?
I think most of the fear around pivoting comes from fear of the sunk cost. The questions I started to ask myself were like, do I feel like do I feel like it's getting stale or stagnant, or like there's not as much growth happening or as much rapid growth happening? That's like kind of question number one. Question number two is like, do I have an inkling of like where I think this could go? And if I didn't think about the sunk cost at all and I just thought about the future, would I be able to make that jump a little bit more naturally? If both of those are kind of aligned, then I think it's worth it to make the shift. I also think like sometimes you think of pivoting as this drastic change to everything all at once. And I would argue there are ways where like you can incrementally do small tests and like get a sense of where you're at. If you are trying to be like really truth seeking and like want to kind of mitigate risk as much as you can, which, you know, in startup, you never can fully do it, but like mitigate as much as you can, then there are always ways to like test it at a light level. Just kind of push your mindset away from like the fear into like what's possible.
Can you take us through one of your own pivots?
I pivoted careers, I pivoted in the company. And I think the biggest one is obviously the company one, just as the freshest in my mind. You know, we were doing employee engagement software for like almost a year and a half. And we just kept hearing this thing from the market. You know, people were telling us about inflation and they were talking to us about this much more like painful issue they were having around understanding their data in a clearer, easier way. And at the same time, they're seeing like all of this new AI emerge and like all of these awesome technologies coming out, and chat GPT and whatever in 2023. And, you know, we're selling employee engagement software, which is still a big problem, still a huge need, but it wasn't as like top of mind for our customers that we were talking to every day. If we were being really, really like clear-minded about it, would we just focus on this problem? And the answer was yes. It was pretty obvious, like within a few months, that like that pivot was the right decision for us, just because there was such a different like pull from the market than we were getting before. People always say that in startups, like, oh, you know, sometimes you're pushing the rock up the hill, and sometimes it's like there's more of a pull. Felt like we were doing exactly the push, and then like it really did feel like a pull. So there's like validation that happens after the fact. Yeah, the tricky thing is always like during that in between phase, like can you think clearly enough and try not to let your fear or like even other preconceived notions you might have like get in the way. There's like also stories around you know, this person stuck the course and then it worked like 4 years. So you kind of get like these anecdotal stories from like all ends. Like if you stay the course, it'll work one day. Just really stick to it. And then for some people, it's like you pivot and then like it really worked. And so you kind of just have to like, I think like really just clear as much as you can out of all the noise and just try to be really like present with like, this is the information that's in front of me. And like, this is what I'm hearing. What do I do with that data? Yeah, for us, that was like, at the time, it seemed like a huge, huge deal. Like in retrospect, it like actually does seem more like just an evolution, because it didn't feel like we lost everything we had like worked on or learned. Like we're still picking up things that we had learned 2 years ago that are relevant now. And you have to like want to kind of do the journey though. Like that's, I think, the biggest thing is like, if you feel conviction around, I want to be a founder, I want to go through this journey, I understand there's going to be ups and downs, like then you can kind of be a little bit more open and like calm to the possibility of like what will emerge from that.
Yeah, there's a few things actually I heard in what you're saying. One of the things is, which voice am I listening to? Is it the voice in my own head? Is it the voice of the past? I've done this a certain way before. Should I listen to that one? Is it the voice that is right in front of me, my customer, that's telling me something? Am I really listening? And am I willing to trust it? Am I willing to let go of the noises that might be louder within our own heads or from our investors or from people who have done it before? But as a founder, somebody else's best practice isn't necessarily yours. What may emerge on its own might be not only even better than what's been done before, but going back to your definition of being more honest, it might be the most honest answer you can get is the one that might be the hardest to listen to, but is the most important one to listen to.
Yeah. And I think like the other thing is, you're trying to optimize for outcomes. You should do that. That is the way that you run a successful business. But I think like there's also this element of like, where am I being guided? Where am I being pulled? You can't always see like what that output is going to look like until you make that jump or even that like small test. The tension that you're talking about too is like the biggest voice is like, what's the output going to be? What's the output going to be? And I think like that's where even the truth seeking kind of thing we were talking about at the beginning ends up being valuable, because you kind of have to make the case for yourself ultimately, especially if you're a founder at the end of the day, like that this is like what I believe the truth is. Like I'm gonna go look at it as like a way to seek if that is true. And like you don't always know. And that's like part of the beauty of it.
Something I see with startups that I work with, even in myself in setting up my own business, it's like you can only think and plan so much. The action is the answer. You won't know the answer until you've taken the step. Even this conversation as an example, I was telling you, I said to myself, I'm just going to put a series out there. I downloaded Riverside 2 days ago, just got enough in place for us to have this conversation, and we're going to put it out there and see what comes of it.
It's kind of like the beginning, we were talking about truth and like how I use that as a framework. You have a sense of like how the pieces come together. But the reality is like when you put something out there, it's now like privy to the external forces, which are, your customers, your audience, whatever it is. And that will allow it to like flourish and blossom in ways that like maybe you had predicted or maybe you hadn't predicted. Leaving space for that is always really, I think, tricky and necessary though, ultimately. Like that is the reality. So.
Yeah. So if we recap some of what we talked about when it comes to pivoting is part of seeking the truth. I've seen there's been some stagnancy where we're at. I want to lean in to uncover if this isn't it, then what is it? What evidence do I need to pull together to see if this direction is the direction that we should explore? And then once we have tested and chosen to take that path, be willing to be open to whatever comes from there.
Yeah, I think you summarized it perfectly. I think like, it also helps having good people around you, like a good team, and being able to kind of continue to like gather evidence and like work with smart people to like validate that. I'm talking about it in the context of like, this is how I'm viewing it in my framework. But the reality is I had an awesome team and they helped think through a lot of these things too. Being really clear with yourself and then like surrounding yourself with good people, bringing those two things together kind of produces good things. It's so abstract to like describe pivoting, but I thought the questions you asked in the summary you ended with is like exactly what it is. It is a little abstract, but there are frameworks, there are like tools, and there are like ways you can kind of guide yourself and your group to a good place.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that, because a couple weeks ago, I actually gave my first talk on pivoting to a female founder community. We went through the content. It helped the group to self-reflect around where they were at in their own businesses. And it was the questions that came after the presentation that helped me to see, wait, this is far more abstract than even I was thinking about it, where someone came with a situation she was having and she said, is this considered a pivot? And it wasn't a pivot, but it was interesting for her to start to question, is any shift that I'm trying to make considered a pivot? Whereas in her case, she was improving the user experience. And so she needed to do some market research in order to decide what features do we need to add or remove. But it was a really interesting question, because there's One thing I have seen come up with some other founders and startup leaders I've spoken with is that they shy away from using the word pivot. One guy even said to me when I told him I was starting this newsletter, he's like, maybe don't call it a pivot. Pivot's a negative word. Maybe call it a transformation. And so,
Interesting.
what that speaks to me is also a fear around telling people that we're going to make a change, a
Yeah.
fear that maybe it means, well, you didn't get it right the first time. So that must say something about your ability to build and grow this business. When in reality, the majority of businesses will go through a pivot.
A pivot can sometimes be like interpreted as like, oh, I'm definitely just like going way off track here and I definitely needed to change or whatever. But I think like is like relative. So it's like really relative to like whatever, your circumstances. Like, do you consider Taylor Swift going from country to pop pivot? Maybe not. You know what I mean? Maybe you do. Like, I mean, but it was like a shift, right? And it's a pretty dramatic one. So for her and she kind of made that note. You have to do what's right for you and for your business. There's always fear around like the perception of change, but like ultimately like everything is constantly changing. And I think in a weird way, if you're not changing, I would actually be more afraid of that. If you don't change, like, kind of like you get into that stale and stagnant mode. So I think like being curious and like being open to that and realizing that change is kind of the only constant in life, which I think everybody recognizes when I say it kind of in that cliche way, but like doesn't maybe feels more concerned when it's in the context of like something like like your career. It's being okay with the flow and also kind of creating guardrails and frameworks for yourself that are honest and true to you.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insight today. For
Yeah, thanks
those
for
of you,
having me.
yeah. For those of you who are watching, subscribe to The Pivotal Leader on Substack for practical weekly inspiration for your business, leadership, and personal growth pivots. I look forward to the next conversation, and I'll see you all next month.
Thank you, Farah. Great to chat with you.